to make all these excuses for her. This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, "Oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous!" Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things, and like I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
The vice president to Joe Biden, whether it was a male, female, black, white, or anything else, was going to have a giant political albatross around their neck, and they could perform perfectly or perform imperfectly. But that person was going to be at a disadvantage.
She didn't make a good case.
Well,
she didn't denounce the past stuff that people didn't like. She just tried to ignore it.
I've been on that MSNBC, mate. It was propagandist nutcrackery on there. I went on a show called Morning Joe. It was absurd the way they carried on.
Good Morning Joe.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know what it was. It wasn't morning. There was no one called Joe there. No one could concentrate. They didn't understand the basic tenets of journalism. No one was willing to stick up for genuine American heroes.
Bill Maher is on fire, skillfully deconstructing the overused and outdated arguments presented by MSNBC guests on his show, and the internet can't get enough of it. At this rate, MSNBC journalists might want to rethink their policies and question whether Maher's platform is truly the best place for them. The takedowns have become so thorough and relentless, it's almost become cringe-worthy to watch. So, which MSNBC guest found themselves in Maher's crosshairs this time? And what did Maher say that sent them scrambling for cover? We've got all the details right here, so stay tuned as we break down the issues. But before we get into it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more thought-provoking clips like this.
Everything the candidates, especially the Democrats, do to get voters annoys them. The constant texting. Did you get the texts like from Tim Walz every 5 minutes, and like always begging for money and knocking on doors? We've got people knocking on doors. People don't want knocking on your door. Who in this day and age wants someone knocking on? Kids don't even like it when a phone call. That's like too much of a invasion of their privacy.
Maher brilliantly exposes the hypocrisy in MSNBC's John Heilemann's arguments during a heated discussion. Heilemann suggested that Kamala Harris lost the election because her message failed to connect with the intended audience. However, Maher quickly points out the real issue. It wasn't the message itself, but rather the medium through which it was delivered. The Democrats relied heavily on legacy media outlets like MSNBC and CNN, which were already biased in their favor, essentially preaching to the choir. Meanwhile, Trump successfully reached a much broader audience by appearing on more neutral platforms, such as Joe Rogan's podcast and Theo Von's show. When the traditional media approach faltered, the Democrats took a more invasive route, resorting to mass text messages and even door-to-door canvassing. Instead of adapting to meet voters where they actually were, they doubled down on outdated strategies, alienating potential supporters in the process.
Emerge as the strongest Democratic opposition leader in the next Trump era. Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, like Adam Schiff, he won, right? Big.
He won big. I like Wes Moore.
Wes Moore's fantastic. He's in Maryland.
Yep.
But who's going to be the one? Gavin Newsom, we have here in this state. He's already like called the legislature to. Trump hasn't done anything yet, but I understand the.
This was the problem. There was a 2014 study that showed that Fortune 500 companies were more likely to pick a female CEO if the company was struggling, basically setting women up for the big job, but to also fail. If they did well, fine. But if they failed, like, look, we have a female CEO while failing. And that's what I feel like they did to Kamala Harris. When Biden refused to step aside and not run again, he was supposed to be that bridge. He backed off on that promise due to arrogance. And then he drops out after a catastrophic debate performance, and they set Kamala Harris up to fail.
Exactly is this journalist trying to say? The Democrats seem to believe that their message was already locked and loaded, just waiting for Kamala Harris to step in, amplify it, and magically everything would fall into place. But here's where they completely miss the point. Americans are not easily swayed by rehearsed speeches and neatly packaged rhetoric. They are far more discerning and pragmatic than that. They weren't just absorbing carefully crafted political slogans. They were experiencing the reality of their lives day in and day out. Issues like skyrocketing inflation, a rise in crime, and an unsecured border weren't abstract political talking points. These were problems that impacted their daily lives. These weren't just news stories or headlines to brush aside. They were daily struggles that shaped how voters viewed the world. And what they saw wasn't something that could be swept under the rug with a few catchphrases or promises of change. Americans weren't buying into the Democratic narrative because it wasn't aligning with the reality they were living through. They weren't looking for polished speeches or feel-good political slogans. They were looking for concrete solutions to the real challenges they were facing. Even if Joe Biden had been at the peak of his mental fitness and had delivered every speech flawlessly, it's unlikely it would have made much of a difference. The fundamental problem wasn't just the messenger. It was the message itself. Voters had already tuned out because they weren't seeing a genuine effort to address the issues that mattered most to them. The disconnect between the Democrats' carefully curated messages and the lived experiences of the American people became more apparent by the day, and it was no surprise when voters began to reject what they were being offered. In fact, if anything, Biden's candidacy likely would have suffered even more if the circumstances were different. The problem wasn't just one of execution, it was one of substance. The message simply didn't resonate with voters. They weren't interested in hearing more about the same tired slogans. They were more concerned about the realities of inflation, squeezing their wallets, the rising crime rates in their neighborhoods, and the uncertainty surrounding the security of the border. These were issues that directly impacted their lives, and it's clear that many felt the Democratic Party wasn't doing enough, or anything for that matter, to address them. Instead of evolving their message to meet the concerns of the American people, they doubled down on talking points that had already lost their relevance. It's a lesson in how even the best prepared political speeches and the most polished candidates can fall short if they fail to connect with the very issues that voters care about most.
Set Kamala Harris up to fail. That was a 3-month campaign, and she was supposed to introduce herself to the American people. No wonder people were Googling, did Joe Biden drop out? And so...
No. No. You're saying 3 months wasn't long enough?
It was too long. I mean, it was long enough.
It was long enough.
No.
If they had a primary...
It's not that they didn't have time to introduce. They met someone and didn't like them.
And Bill Maher is absolutely spot on. The issue wasn't that the Democrats lacked capable candidates who could step into Joe Biden's shoes. In fact, as Michael Douglas later pointed out on the show, they had a strong bench, wealth of seasoned, competent leaders ready to take on the mantle. Governors, senators, rising stars. There was no shortage of qualified options. So why did they pass on those individuals? Because, rather than focusing on merit, leadership ability, and competence, they got caught up in the trap of identity politics. They fixated on optics, desperate to appear universally appealing. Their calculation that choosing a black female as vice president would somehow secure the support of both women and black communities. But here's the problem. Politics isn't about checking diversity boxes. It's about connecting with voters through competence, vision, and real solutions. Voters don't just want to feel represented. They want leaders who can actually solve the problems they're facing. By prioritizing symbolism over substance, the Democrats completely misjudged the electorate. They assumed that identity alone would win hearts and votes. But people weren't fooled. The decision felt performative rather than genuine. And, in the end, it wasn't enough to win the trust or secure the victory they were hoping for. That miscalculation, the overemphasis on identity rather than substance, could very well be one of the key reasons the Democrats are facing such intense political backlash today. It's a clear reminder that voters want more than just symbolic gestures. They want leaders who are equipped to address their real-life concerns and deliver tangible results. And when the focus shifts away from true leadership, it becomes clear that optics alone won't cut it.
Sitting vice president, and you get put on elevated to the top of the ticket 107 days ahead of the election. I think that is a very high degree of difficulty put on anybody. And I do not think she is the perfect candidate. I tend to agree with Sarah that probably in a fully litigated primary, she probably would not have been the Democratic nominee, but will never know that. But I will tell you that, there's never been anybody who's had the difficulty of that situation, elevated that late in the campaign. Why?
Needed to run away from
Bill, I don't know if you know this, but the vice president of the United States is basically shoved in a broom closet for 3.5 years.
I know.
You couldn't.
She was more popular in there.
Yes, well.
I mean, this idea that in a mass media age, that 107 days is not long enough to know somebody?
You are way overestimating the American people in terms of what their
was right there. This is exactly the kind of attitude that led the Democrats straight into opposition. Underestimating the American people. John Heilemann from MSNBC actually had the nerve to claim that Bill Maher's assertion that 3 months was more than enough time for citizens to make up their minds was an overestimation of Americans. Really? Is this how the woke left sees the rest of us? Like we're incapable of critical thinking or making informed decisions. It's no wonder one MSNBC host had the audacity to declare that Americans don't even know what they want. Newsflash. We absolutely do. And it's certainly not a puppet who blindly follows the bidding of the woke left. Americans don't want leaders who treat them like they're clueless. We want leaders who respect our intelligence, understand our struggles, and actually stand up for our interests. The left can keep underestimating the American people, but when election time rolls around, they'll learn the hard way that we know exactly what we want, and we're not afraid to vote for it. Anyway, keep the clip rolling.
Donald Trump has become a universally known, understood, loved by some, hated by others over the course of being omnipresent for 8 years.
Decades.
Okay.
Barack Obama becomes president of the United States after running for 2 years as president, runs a 50-state primary, is on television, does dozens of Democratic debates, and by the time at the end of that, most people knew who he was. Most people.
Yeah.
You drop somebody into the middle of the top of the ticket, 3 days out, 3 months out. You are going to have to spend a lot of time trying to introduce yourself to the country while also being in a steel cage death match with Donald Trump.
Okay, but I don't know if you ever watched this show, but I had Michael Douglas on this week.
Yeah.
At the top, we were talking about this, and he made a very good point that every other country in the world can do it in months, sometimes weeks. Why can every other country do it in that shorter period of time? Are they all that so much brighter than America? I don't think so.
Exactly. This is precisely the point I'm making. Some countries have managed to hold decisive elections in just a matter of weeks. Yet the Democrats are acting like Americans are incapable of making up their minds in the same time frame. With this mentality, the Democrats might be better off in opposition because they're failing to grasp the obvious. Their disastrous mismanagement of the economy, paired with their out-of-touch and often ridiculous policies, is exactly what landed them in the mess they're in today. Americans aren't easily fooled. They're smart, discerning, and deeply aware of what's happening around them. They know the reality. The economy, our borders, and even the future of our children felt more secure under Donald Trump than it does under the Biden-Harris administration. It wasn't just about jobs or inflation. It was about security, leadership, and common sense. And when you look at what this administration has been doing, it's clear that they failed to deliver on any of those fronts. In fact, I'll say it again, Biden would have lost this election no matter who the Democrats put forward. Kamala Harris, Gretchen Whitmer, or even Gavin Newsom. It wouldn't have made a difference. It was never just about Kamala Harris. It was about failed leadership, reckless policies, and an administration completely disconnected from the realities faced by everyday Americans. The Democrats didn't lose because of one candidate. They lost because their entire agenda failed. The very people they claim to represent. Until they come to terms with that, they'll keep losing.
I can believe that you could have shorter elections in America, but it's not like we don't know. In Britain, for instance, when you have a short election, it's not like you don't know who the leader of the party is for months and years before that.
But you're either the person who's Googling the day before, did Biden drop out, or you know in a week. You know, did anyone in this audience not know enough about Kamala Harris pretty much after a week to make a decision? Yeah, it just people.
How
It's
are you gonna
ridiculous.
enforce
We just get sicker of them.
Finally delivered the hammer blow, and it landed with stunning force. John Heilemann was exposed for his blatant hypocrisy, and Ma didn't just argue his point. He backed it up with a simple yet powerful experiment. Turning to his audience, which was largely left-leaning, he posed a straightforward question. How many of you feel you don't know enough about Kamala Harris to decide whether to vote for her or not? The response? Dead silence. Not a single hand was raised. Not a single voice spoke up. The room fell into an uncomfortable stillness, thick with the weight of unspoken truth. You could almost see the color drain from Heilemann's face. The awkward tension in the air was undeniable. His claim that Americans didn't have enough information to judge Harris crumbled in real time. Heilemann watched as his argument fell, apart under the weight of the obvious, and the emptiness of his stance was exposed for all to see. With nowhere to turn, he fumbled, trying to backpedal and save face. But it was too late. The audience's silence wasn't just awkward, it was deafening. It wasn't a mere pause. It was a verdict. A verdict that said Americans aren't confused about Kamala Harris. They know exactly who she is, what she stands for, and why they're hesitant. In that moment, Ma didn't just win the argument. He exposed the uncomfortable reality that Heilemann and the Democrats refused to face. They had underestimated the American people, assuming that they could manipulate the narrative, with clever rhetoric and performative gestures. But the truth was undeniable. Americans are not in the dark about Kamala Harris or the direction the Democratic Party is taking. They are more aware than ever, and that awareness is exactly why they're reluctant to buy into what's being sold.
I have to make all these excuses for her. This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, "Oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous!" Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things, and I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
I'm
not some sexism.
I'm willing to elect a woman when she's the best candidate that they're offered. That's that simple.
I think they are not. I think they were very unlikely to elect whether the vice president to Joe Biden, who had a
that's it.
Who had a
that's what they didn't like.
The vice president to Joe Biden, whether it was a male, female, black, white, or anything else, was going to have a giant political albatross around their neck, and they could perform perfectly or perform imperfectly. But that person was going to be at a disadvantage.
She didn't make a good case.
Well,
she didn't denounce the past stuff that people didn't like. She just tried to ignore it.
If Kamala Harris had steered clear of the woke left's policies and introduced a breath of fresh air into Biden's campaign, the political landscape could look very different today. Imagine if she had focused on real-world policies that directly addressed the everyday struggles of Americans. Policies targeting the economy, border security, crime, and the skyrocketing cost of living. If she had distanced herself from the extreme rhetoric and embraced common-sense solutions that reflected the concerns of the broader American populace. She wouldn't just be more competitive. She might be in power right now, or at the very least, giving Trump a serious run for his money. Bill Maher isn't the only one frustrated with John Heilemann's stance. Actor and comedian Russell Brand has also called him out for his disingenuous and hypocritical position. It's not just Maher who's recognizing the flawed logic behind the mainstream left's approach. It's becoming increasingly clear to people across the political spectrum that there's a disconnect between the rhetoric coming from figures like Heilemann and the reality facing average Americans. Harris, and the Democratic Party as a whole, missed an opportunity to pivot toward policies that could have resonated with voters. And now they're paying the price.
That MSNBC, mate. It was propagandist nutcrackery on there. I went on a show called Morning Joe. It was absurd the way they carried on.
Good Morning Joe.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. It wasn't morning. There was no one called Joe there. No one could concentrate. They didn't understand the basic tenets of journalism. No one was willing to stick up for genuine American heroes.
And is absolutely right. MSNBC has become nothing more than a propaganda machine for the woke left, and they've proven it time and time again. Despite Bill Maher repeatedly driving home the point that the American people simply didn't resonate with Kamala Harris's message, John Heilemann just didn't seem to get it. It's as if he was more committed to defending the narrative than acknowledging the reality staring him in the face. This is the problem with echo chambers. They're so focused on reinforcing their own beliefs that they miss the truth right in front of them. In the end, Bill Maher isn't just hosting debates, he's exposing the cracks in the left's arguments. If MSNBC guests keep stepping into his arena unprepared, they'll keep facing public takedowns. The message is clear. Bring stronger arguments, or be ready for another embarrassing reality check. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Sitting vice president, and you get put on elevated to the top of the ticket 107 days ahead of the election. I think that is a very high degree of difficulty to put on anybody. And I do not think she is the perfect candidate. I tend to agree with Sarah that probably, in a fully litigated primary, she probably would not have been the Democratic nominee, but we'll never know that. But I will tell you that, like, there's never been anybody who's had the difficulty of that situation, elevated that late in the campaign. Why?
Democrat would have needed to run away from
Bill,
the
I don't know
Biden
if you know this, but the Vice President of the United States is basically shoved in a broom closet for 3.5 years.
I know.
Like, you couldn't.
She was more popular in there.
Yes, well.
I mean, this idea that in a mass media age,
That 107 days is not long enough to know somebody?
You are way overestimating the American people in terms of what they